I always feel at a disadvantage to have to speak after Professor John Dugard. But what I'm going to do, what I hope to achieve today, is to examine the international law violations that Israel commits today, rather than looking at the legality of historical measures, as Victor Catan has done and as Professor John Dugard has also touched on. But I want to widen my analysis from merely examining the legality of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, which is something that is very well rehearsed, and to look instead at some of the broader issues of Israel's compliance with international law. And in particular, I want to pose and try to answer what I think is a very fundamental question, a question that lies at the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that question is the following: can the state of Israel, as it was established, and in the way that it currently maintains itself, be a state that complies with the rules of international law and respects Palestinian human rights? And I want to answer that question by saying the answer is broadly no, by arguing the following points. I want to say, first of all, that Israel's establishment and maintenance as a so-called Jewish state means that it necessarily has laws and carries out policies and practices that violate international law. And secondly, that under international law, Israel has various obligations. It has obligations to stop carrying out unlawful policies and practices that it carries out today. And it also has an obligation to make reparation for unlawful acts that it carried out in the past. And that if it complies with those two obligations, what that in effect means is that it will have to undergo a fairly radical, essentially constitutional change from being a so-called Jewish state to a state for all its citizens. Okay, and I'm going to unpack those arguments, hopefully staying within my 15-minute time limit. But just to be clear, what I'm in essence saying is that there is, in my view, a contradiction between a proper compliance with international law by Israel, on the one hand, and Israel's maintenance as a so-called Jewish state. So before I get into the meat of my arguments, I just want to clarify my terms. When I say Jewish state, I'm talking about the definition of a Jewish state as Israel, in the way that Israel defines itself, which is basically a situation in which Jews are defined as primarily as a sort of a national and an ethnic group, and to a certain extent also a religious group. And the state is a professed state of the Jewish people. So it's a state that privileges Jews, and that also, as a matter of practice, created and currently actively maintains a majority, tries to maintain a majority Jewish population in the territory over which it presides. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's what I mean when I say a Jewish state, a state that privileges Jews in its laws, policies, practices, institutions, and which actively, which established and tries to maintain a Jewish majority population. And the other thing I'd like to clarify is that I'm not saying that there's necessarily a problem with a Jewish state in theory, that a Jewish state established in any circumstances anywhere in the world would necessarily violate international law. Because we can imagine a situation where a Jewish state was established, let's say, on a desert island where there was no indigenous population, that no population claimed, and it might get along okay, although I think it would run into some difficulties as well. I think that the main problem here is we have a Jewish state established, obviously, as we all know, in a territory which had a non-Jewish majority indigenous population, the Arab Palestinian population. And so it's a state which essentially it purports to represent an ethnic group which is different to the indigenous ethnic group of the territory that it controls. And therein lies the problem. So, first of all, what I need to do in order to hopefully persuade you of my argument is establish that Israel's Jewish character means it inevitably carries out international law violations. And secondly, that Israel's compliance with its international law obligations would lead, in effect, to an unravelling of its Jewish character. Okay, so first of all, what are the violations of international law that I say inevitably stem from Israel's so-called Jewish character? And very briefly, because I'm sure many of you are aware of the history, there are the violations that were entailed in Israel's establishment as a Jewish state. So there was the ethnic cleansing of the majority Palestinian population into the areas that became Israel, the widespread appropriation and destruction of Palestinian property. And Zionist forces had to carry out these actions in order to ensure that the new state of Israel would have a majority settler Jewish population and would have land and property at its disposal. So, of course, ethnic cleansing, destruction, appropriation of property, these are violations of the laws of armed conflict and constitute international crimes. So those are the violations that I say necessarily stem from Israel's establishment. What about the unlawful policies and practices that Israel has to carry out and carries out to this day in order to maintain itself as a Jewish state? So in other words, in order to maintain the new status quo that was created after 1948. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, especially because of the limitations of time, but in order to just really simplify it, basically you have the state, as I said, as a constitutionally privileges Jews. It is a state for the Jewish people and for no other ethnic group. And as a result of that, you basically have a kind of a regime of laws, policies and practices that explicitly or implicitly lead to the institutionalized racial discrimination against Palestinians, both in Israel proper and in the occupied Palestinian territory. And so you have, for example, in 2012, the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination criticizing Israel for not having a right to equality in its laws and for practicing racial discrimination, segregation and apartheid. More recently, you have the UN report that was published initially by the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. I'm sure many of you will know the story. And then it was disavowed by the UN Secretary General, but it was on the UN's website for about 24 hours. And for those of you who read it within those 24 hours, of course, it's available elsewhere now. That report accuses Israel of practicing apartheid more generally vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And that includes Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, within Israel proper, and also the Palestinian refugees. And I don't think it's important for us to get stuck on whether or not Israel's really practicing apartheid within its own borders or just a severe form of racial discrimination. The point I would like to make is that whichever way you look at it, it's committing international law violations because there is this matrix of discrimination against the Palestinians that is, in a sense, present in all layers of Israeli law and policy and practice. And I'll just give you one example. If we look broadly at nationality and citizenship law and policy in Israel, you have a situation where the Israeli law of return allows Jews anywhere in the world the right automatically to acquire Israeli citizenship. So effectively, Jews everywhere in the world are Israeli nationals. And you have another law that applies to everybody else. Of course, in effect, it applies to the Palestinians, which says they can only become Israeli citizens if they had been present legally in the territory that became Israel between 1948 and 1952. And what that does, because most Palestinians were expelled between 1948 and 1952 and weren't able to return in those years, what that effectively does is it denationalized those Palestinians. It stripped them of their nationality of what became the new state, and so they became stateless refugees. And there's an ongoing policy, of course, that we all know about, not to allow the refugees and their descendants to return to their homes. So we have a series of international law violations which are committed with respect to this nationality and citizenship law and policy, including violations of norms, as I said, prohibiting racial discrimination, potentially amounting to apartheid, violations of customary law rules relating to the law of nationality, the prohibition against denationalization. We have violations of international human rights law in terms of the fact that persons should not be arbitrarily prohibited from entering their own country. You have violations of United Nations Resolution 194, which has called for the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. So what I hope I've explained here is that now, of course, that policy is there to ensure, as I said, a Jewish majority in the land that Israel controls, and a privileging of Jews over other ethnic racial groups, i.e. the Palestinians. So what I hope I have demonstrated is that there are these violations of international law that Israel carried out both in its establishment and in order to maintain itself as a so-called Jewish state, and that those violations of international law are an inevitable consequence of Israel's character. Now, the second point that I would like to establish is that were Israel to comply fully with its duties under international law today, it would not be possible for it to carry out the policies and practices which mean that it is able to maintain its so-called Jewish character. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, firstly, under international law, all states, including Israel, are obliged to make full reparation for past unlawful acts, including by reversing essentially the consequences of those unlawful acts. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is all states, including Israel, are obliged to stop carrying out unlawful policies and practices that they carry out today, in the present moment. And we can see how that would play out. If those obligations were fulfilled by Israel, how would that play out in the arena of nationality, citizenship, and refugee policy and law? First of all, Israel would have to allow for the Palestinian refugees' right of return. Secondly, it would probably have to allow those denationalized Palestinians the right to acquire citizenship in Israel. It would thirdly have to, in effect, dismantle the regime, that matrix of discriminatory laws and policies and practices that ensure that Jews in Israel are privileged with respect to nationality and citizenship, and Palestinians are discriminated against. So you can see that if those things were done by Israel, I struggle to see how Israel would, A, be able to necessarily maintain its majority Jewish population, because many Palestinian refugees may well choose to return to their homes. And secondly, I don't see how it could continue to be a state that privileges Jews and discriminates against Palestinians. So, in conclusion, what I hope I have persuaded you of is that, first of all, the actions Israel had to undertake, that it still carries out in order to be a so-called Jewish state, are unlawful under international law. And that secondly, in order to abide by international law, Israel would have to effectively reverse these policies and practices. And I think what that really would mean in practice is a kind of constitutional change in Israel, from Israel being a state, a so-called Jewish state, a state that privileges Jews, to a state of all its citizens. And that we don't have to necessarily go back to the historical record and argue about the legality of measures taken during Israel's establishment and before, like the partition resolution. We can actually just look at the state of play today, what international law obligations are on Israel today, and say that there would really have to be, in my view, a radical change within Israel, and not only vis-à-vis the occupied Palestinian territories, but also with respect to how it treats its citizens, current Palestinian citizens, and the refugees which it effectively denationalized and excluded and dispossessed in 1948. Thank you very much.